introduction. Good morning to the class. You know you have a test after this? It's worth 10 points. Maybe you can get the answers from this.
I'm from Australia.
Yes. So, if we were to gather a group of experts in sport pedagogy and ask them to pick one word or two words that define what they think, how they would describe games within physical education, the answer would probably be best described as a common, what we call a double-edged sword. And what we mean by that is both sides are sharp and both sides have positives and negatives. And so on one side, we get results from students and we do surveys about what they enjoy about physical education. And typically games and sports become the most popular choice, like ahead of fitness, ahead of swimming, ahead of gymnastics, for example. And so the key there is that they provide not only the most playful component, right, and humans and animals are bred to play, but also that they provide the most significant opportunities for socialising. It's sort of difficult sometimes to socialise when you're doing an activity that doesn't involve a lot of interaction. And so a number of authors have found from their research that this seems to be the case, that games are the most preferred form of physical education. However, the enjoyment that young people get, and many of them get, is not universal. In other words, empirical evidence suggests that some students, particularly those who are lower in skill, maybe, show levels of dissatisfaction for games instruction. I'm going to talk about two main themes here that we develop when we understand what we mean by that. And the first one is that a lot of students describe games instruction, not the playing of games, but the instruction of games, as boring and irrelevant, whereas there's another group that looks at the idea of it being discriminatory and sometimes even including abusive practices. So let's look at what we mean by boring. This boring and irrelevant instruction typically takes place where you've got teachers who do the same content over and over and over. And so students are typically under challenge. So we do volleyball, we start again on volleyball and we learn how to serve. And we do that in 7th grade, and we do it in 8th grade, and we do it in 9th grade, over and over again. Likewise, they'll do the same content, and they typically only do it for a short period of time. So when students see themselves as being under-challenged by activities that don't contribute to their fitness or their interest level, they become particularly frustrated, often bored. And indeed, many students hold perceptions, right, when we talk to them about what did you learn during these particular units, that physical education has no impact on their skill improvement. And it's their belief that the activities that were taught have no transfer to what they do outside of school. And so David Kirk, who's a sort of sport pedagogy philosopher, if anything, if we wanted to give him a label, has critiqued this, what he calls molecular approach, the finite practicing of skills, as physical education as sport techniques. And it's best summarised when we ask students what they mean by this, and they'll tell us that we already know how to dribble. We've been doing it forever. But every time we start basketball, teachers make us do dribbling again. And so while the underlying intent of these units is why these teachers keep repeating and going over and over content, is to allow students to get, in many cases, greater opportunities to find activities that they enjoy. Typically, the unintended consequence is that students get bored in what we call decontextualised physical education. In other words, what young people are doing in their physical education doesn't relate to how the sports perform outside of school. And so there's this lack of authenticity, and it doesn't include much student decision making, and students are put in situations where they have to solve games problems, and essentially they don't develop any great understanding of how the game works. In physical education and sport techniques, it's also the teacher who controls all the agenda. All the decisions are made by the teacher about when to progress and what the content is. And that leads to minimal levels of student autonomy. It doesn't really lead to high levels of student perceptions of success or indeed relatedness. The other thing that tends to go along with this physical education and sport techniques is this idea of short units. And so many teachers have it in their heads that we can't do an extended period of work with one particular sport like volleyball or tennis or badminton because the students will get bored. Right? And essentially what happens is that we repeat one unit year after year and we start from the beginning again. And so when these units are short, 5, 6, 8 lessons, which is really common, the students aren't put in a position where they can develop any mastery. And so, of course, when they don't get mastery, then they can't play a good game. When they can't play a good game, then it becomes boring and irrelevant. The second theme that we talk about when we look at some of the negatives of game instruction is this idea of discriminatory and abusive practices. And this takes place in situations where you play typically full-sided games, so 5 versus 5 basketball, 11 versus 11 football. And you have certain players, typically the boys, who are highly skilled, who dominate not only the conduct of play, but the access to it, marginalising and alienating what we call lower skilled boys and girls. And so there's lots of cases that we've looked at the research where these games are typically not developmentally appropriate. In other words, the demands of the game aren't matching the skills of the players. The lower skilled players are intimidated, and as a result they tend to disengage and become what we call confident bystanders. So they're really good at looking like they're playing, so they're in the game, the ball comes to them, they'll do something, but they'll not actively chase after the ball or try to engage into practice. Typically, the non-cooperative and individualised nature of the learning experiences in these games tends to further focus on this idea of masculinity and boys' aggressive play. And so the teacher, as a result, is tending to spend his or her time divided between controlling these particular group of players, trying to get them to cooperate with the others, and in class management. And so the lower skilled students, once again, are left behind because they're not getting the feedback they need to improve in their skill. So what I want to do today is, in this presentation, is talk about what we call second generation models. And it's a group of models that look at ways to present sport within physical education, which are focused on what we call democratic and student-centered practice. In other words, they're gameplay where students get to make decisions, where they get to control some of the agenda of the progression of practice of what students do. And so what I'll do is I'll outline a number of these different models, and then I'll discuss with each one of them what the essential component of that model is, like how does it work, what does it look like, and then follow that with a brief research about what's being conducted on that particular model. And then the second half, or not the second half, but after that, what I'll do is I'll spend time focusing on how we can increase and improve the research on these particular curriculum models so that we can ask what we call good research questions using appropriate designs, demonstrating fidelity, so how do we know that the people are doing what they're supposed to be doing, and then suggesting that we need a more interpretive approach to what's happening in our research, not so much number driven, but really looking at how can we make the experience for young people better. The essential principle underlying all of these models is that they're based on play. Right? Playing the game becomes the primary agenda. It's the primary focus of the teacher. And if we're developing skill, we develop skill through playing the game. If we develop understanding, we develop understanding through playing the game. So it's the playfulness part of it that's really put to the foreground. So the most common, widely used, widely written about, widely researched model of these second generation models is sport education. And the goal of sport education is to present an authentic, developmentally appropriate sporting experience for schools, for children. And what we mean by authentic is that we take all the aspects of sport that young people experience when they're playing community sport, like for their school or in their club, and we transfer that into physical education. So the idea that they become part of a team and stay part of that team, they're not changing teams every day, but they're playing in meaningful competition, so when the results of that particular competition count for something, and then it's quite festive, right? You have uniforms, you have some sort of protocols that you go through when you play. By developmentally appropriate, what we mean is that we engage students in ways where they can successfully participate. So, we take the good parts of sport, the teamwork, the excitement of the competition, and we modify it by trying to exclude some of the parts of sport that naturally precludes children. So in other words, we wouldn't play 11-a-side football, we wouldn't play 5-a-side basketball. We play 3-on-3 basketball, and we may play 4-on-4 volleyball. So the key principles of sport education, what does it look like? Well, first of all, it mimics a season. So for example, the German Bundesliga, the American basketball, Australian football, Israeli basketball season, wherever you are, they play over an extended period of time. And what that's designed to do is allow teams to improve, to experience the ups and downs of the season, to experience the full component of what you do during a sports team. So you practice your skills, you might have competition games against other teams in the pre-season where those games don't count for anything, it's just a chance for you to learn about your team, maybe decide which players are going to play in what position, and then you have the formal competition later. So we need to make the first commitment in physical education to allocate a longer period of time to this particular one activity. The second part of sport education, the second criteria, is that players are members of teams and they stay on that team for the entire season. So you don't see in school sport, club sport or professional sport players changing teams every week. Cristiano Ronaldo doesn't play for Real Madrid this week, then for the next 3 weeks he might play for Sevilla, and then he transfers again to Barcelona. We have consistent team membership. These seasons are defined by what we call formal competition. Right? There are games that count. You keep score, it goes on a league table. You get points for winning and losing. And interspersed between those games is teacher instruction and student-led practices. So you'll play a game, and typically what happens in sport, you look at the score, you look at what your team did successfully and what you need practice on, then you'll go and address those particular practices, then you're coming back and play another game. And that's how the season works. One of the big differences between sport education and sport in school context, in terms of school teams or club sport or professional sport, is that students take on roles other than player. So when I played sport, I was a player, that was my job. The only role I might have had within that team was perhaps captain, which I never was, but that's how you could be. In sport education, everybody has a job within their team. So someone might be the equipment manager, so they're responsible at the beginning of every lesson to collect the equipment, to set up their field, to make sure the team has jerseys or the ball or whatever. Someone else might be the fitness leader, so that person will conduct the warm-ups and the physical training part of the team. Someone else will be the captain coach, so or the trainer, and they'll get information from the teacher about what he or she wants them to practice, and will go and lead those practices. The other thing that occurs in sport education is that during competition, while two teams are playing, a third team from the class acts as the officials. So they act as referees, they act as scorekeepers, they act as statisticians. And there's all sorts of roles that students can take. We've had situations where fourth graders have been commentators. We've had TV crews. We have live streaming. So for example, in the school where they're playing, we've got a camera in the roof, and there's a big like jumbotron here, where the younger kids can watch the game as it goes along. And then finally there's what we call a culminating event, something at the end of the season where everybody comes together and we determine the teams that are going to be the winners. We might have sort of a final situation. Through this process, we're trying to develop three fundamental goals. There's three achievement tasks that we want. First of all is this one of competence. We want our young people to be able to play what we call a good game. So in this case of frisbee, that you see on the screen, we want them to be able to throw and catch. We want them to be able to move in space when they don't have possession. We want them to be able to guard another player successfully. We want them to be able to support the player without the frisbee or with the frisbee, by moving in a position where they become available and open. In badminton, we want them to be able to serve, be able to do a clear, maybe to do a drop shot, and have a game against someone of similar ability that they can have an enjoyable experience, and one where they're developing some skill. Our second goal is we want the students to be literate. In other words, we want them to understand and value the traditions and rituals that distinguish good sport and bad sport practices. So one of the underlying themes of this notion of literacy is fair play. So we want the students to understand that, first of all, for a game to take place, it can't exist unless there's two teams playing together under equal circumstances. So the idea of thanking or shaking hands at the end of the game, irrespective of the result, is at least thanks for coming, because if you weren't here, we couldn't play. So you acknowledge your opponent, you play as hard as you can during the game, at the end you recognise them. And what we do in sport education is we grade this. So if we have two teams playing, the third team that's keeping the score will also grade the teams on their fair play. And the point system for that counts just as much or often more than the match result. And different sports have different protocols. Right? The way you conduct yourself as a spectator in golf is different from the way you conduct yourself as a spectator during swimming or tennis or basketball. And so we teach the young people ways in which, when they go out into the community and participate in those events, that they can be good spectators as well. And the third goal is we want them to be enthusiastic participators. So we want the young people to be highly engaged in the activity. We want them to enjoy the experience, to play hard, to play fair. And you can see when we take snapshot photographs of these young people during games that there's this high intensity of engagement. Everybody's seriously involved. So if you look at this particular photo here, everybody's really locked in and concentrating on their particular job, whether they're on or off the ball. Now, as I said, there's three real differences between, we're not just taking the German Football League and putting it into sport. We're not taking the Israeli Basketball League and putting it into schools. We make some fundamental differences. The first one is that everybody plays all the time. And so by having 4 versus 4 games, or 3 versus 3, or 5 versus 5, everybody's on the court as much as possible. Now, sometimes with class composition, we might have 1 or 2 players extra on the team, but we engage in substitution rule that players transfer in and out. And so you can see here on this scooter handball example, where we have the blues and the yellows, there's basically only 4 or 5 players on the team. There's a couple of players in defence. Secondly, we make them developmentally appropriate. So we take the game form, what are the things we want the students to learn in our 18 to 20 lessons, and we design the experiences for them that maximise their ability to learn those skills. And typically that's by having small-sided games and by having modified rules. And then, of course, there's this idea of diverse roles. So you can see in the image, one of the young girls there is the goal referee for that particular end of the court. Then the other people taking the score, then the other people keeping statistics. And so you're not just participating as players during the season, you have these other administrative tasks. And everybody does all of them over the time. So you can see here some examples of roles. On the upper left, you have a timekeeper and one of the referees. Below them, you have 2 mascots from a couple of the teams, the Tigers and the Cows. Then on the going again against the clock, you have one boy who's keeping the recording, doing the video. And then above, you have the score bench, you have commentators, you might have some statisticians. And so these things take place and young people learn different skills as they participate. So what's the research on sport education tell us? So this aim is competent, literate and enthusiastic in terms of participation. However, the earliest review, the first one done in 2005, tended to focus on what the major goals of physical education are. We call them the big five, like motor skill development, fitness, knowledge, social development and values and attitudes. And two researchers, one from the United States and one from Ireland, did a research on all of the studies, and I'll read what they said was the most significant outcome. Evidence suggests that sport education, with its emphasis on persistent team membership, promotes personal and social development in the form of student responsibility, cooperation and trust skills. Student leadership within the model, that's students taking a role particularly as coach, has been identified as potentially problematic for content development and the promotion of equitable participation. So that was the first thing that they looked at in terms of what were some of the issues that people then had to investigate in the future. So they said that future research is required to examine the dynamics of peer interactions. What are students doing and saying to each other during this decision-making process? And subsequent content learning and performance that occurs. So they found that the enthusiastic participation part of things was very consolidated, that the enjoyment and the literacy was there, but there was a few issues with skill competence. Just a year later, Gary Kinchin, a researcher from England, tended to focus more on the students' and teachers' response. What were those stakeholders saying about sport education? And generally it was considered by students that it was better than before. Right? And so particularly there was an opportunity to become affiliated with a team. So these previous young people who were isolated and were never really engaged in play, because they were with a group for an extended period of time, what tended to happen was that everybody in that team helped them to try to become a better player because it was actually in their best interests. They also endorsed the opportunities to have responsibility and ownership within their teams and expressed high levels of seriousness in their fulfillment of roles. So when young people were asked to referee, when they were asked to kick score, when they were asked to be an equipment manager, they really invested in that position and they treated it very seriously. For teachers, the value for them was that they were now placed off centre stage. So they weren't the orchestra conductor, right, telling everybody, this group over here do this, you do this, practice this, come over here, stop doing this. They could step back, watch what was going on and help individual students or individual teams in cases where they needed some sort of assistance. And so what happens is that they became energised as teachers because in the fundamental process, in the first case, they weren't controlling every lesson event. And then secondly, they could see the students becoming more engaged and more invested, and that gave them some sort of excitement. Now most recently, well, 2012, my review was focusing on the development of these particular three competencies that are required for the model. So we know that competence is developing. Let's say the data that we have for the development of competence is starting to become more and more consistent, in that while students in traditional games instruction can improve, typically what happens is we get greater levels of improvement in sport education, or we get improvement in skill, particularly in game play, not the isolated badminton serve test, but the way young people play a game of badminton or play a game of football is superior to what they would achieve if they were just doing teacher-directed instruction. In terms of literacy, we have some sort of emerging data that tells us that young people are able to identify these appropriate sport practices and engage in them. And then finally, the whole idea of enthusiasm has been substantially demonstrated. In other words, every study that looks at students' involvement and engagement tells us that they do so in a way that's really exciting for them. So that's sport education in a 5-minute nutshell. There are a number of other game-centered approaches, and I'll go through each of these. The focus of these is learning the technical skills within physical education and then transferring them to games is a flawed ideology. In other words, dribbling in and out of cones, passing to one person back and forward, volleying a volleyball back over a net, doesn't translate to a game, doesn't develop substantive skill. And so the underlying approach to all of these models is that game skill is best developed in the circumstances that most closely represent the situation where the skills will be used in a game. So for example, if you're going to drive a car, right, we start a little bit learning how to drive in the parking lot, but then we get out onto the road as quickly as possible. So we're trying to teach the transfer. We're trying to teach game play so that it's successful in the context of games itself. And so the list of the models that we've got here, teaching games for understanding, tactical games, game sense, play practice, invasion games, confidence model, and tactical decision model, are all based on that fundamental preface. The first of these appeared in 1982, when a group of English folks were looking at game play, and they came to the conclusion that what was happening was that there was no linkage between what young people were doing in terms of skill development and what was happening during game play. Essentially because it was highly teacher structured, students didn't have much input into play and what was going on as a result of it. So if we look at teaching games for understanding as the first one, because it's the oldest, it's probably the most universal. If you gave the acronym of TGFU to people in sport, pedagogy or physical education, most of them in most places would know what you meant. Like all of the others, games are modified to suit the skills and experiences of the students. So we wouldn't play tennis on a full-size tennis court with a full-size racket. We might play on a smaller court with a smaller racket with balls that don't bounce as much. Skill learning is tied into developing the tactical knowledge of the game. And these tactical problems are what the teacher thinks about first. Right? Rather than how to hit the ball, rather how to serve, the fundamental task is what do we need to do to be able to play a good game of tennis, for example. And the first principle of that is hit the ball where the other person isn't. Right? That's the way you win in these games, to make the ball unreturnable. And so we'll design a game where you can be most successful if you do that. So the bunker and thought model outlined 6 stages in which take place in a cycle, which start with modified games. So the first thing you do is play. So you'll play this particular game of 2 versus 2 tennis on a really wide court that's very short, for example. Then you stop and you think, well, what do we need to do to be successful? We talk about game awareness and game appreciation. And from that we develop some tactical awareness. And what are the good decisions that we make? So we hit the ball over here, so the person goes and retrieves it, and then when it comes back, we might hit it to the other side. I mean, that's our first decision. And then we practice our ability to do that skill, then we'll return to the game. And so players develop expertise as the game develops. And as they become more skillful, you change the nature of the game a little bit. So you might make the court a little bit bigger, you might introduce a faster ball, you might lower the height of the net, for example. And so students, through teaching games for understanding, are given multiple opportunities to problem solve. So on another day, you might play on a really long court that's very narrow. So the idea is to move the player forward and back, whereas previously we learned to move from side to side. So what do we know about the research on teaching games for understanding? It's essentially followed 2 lines of inquiry. There's been 2 series of research studies. The first one is what do teachers and students think of this? Right? That's typically one of the first phases that when we do research on any innovation in curriculum, we ask the stakeholders, what was it like? What did you think about it? What did you enjoy? Both pre-service and in-service teachers, first of all, experienced some sort of difficulty in putting this into place. Teachers themselves appreciated this whole idea of not, again, being totally locked in and focused on class management, but to focus more on student learning. Students, on the other hand, believed that they learn more about game rules and tactics, and they also suggested that they gave a greater effort. The second line of inquiry, so once we know that the teachers seem to appreciate this, the students suggested they gave a good effort, was to look at what's actually happening from an outcomes perspective. And so what they did was they would run units doing games for understanding and compare these with the outcomes, decision-making, gameplay performance and skill, for example, of students in more direct instruction. Now there's been two major reviews of their work in this, one in 2006, one in 2014. And the results have been a little bit what we call equivocal. That means one side's not demonstrating that it's significantly better than the other, particularly in respect to skill execution. So the throwing and catching, the striking, seem to be about the same between the two, particularly when it involves the player with the ball. However, where games for understanding tends to outperform more traditional instruction is what happens when players don't have the ball. Right? What's this fourth player in basketball doing when the other two are dribbling and passing? They are the ones that tend to be moving into space better. They're the ones that are making better defensive actions. Following the development of games for understanding teaching, there was a brief, modified version called tactical games. And like the others, it approaches the development of skill within the gameplay itself. And like the 6 model format, this other tactical games follows this cycle of you play, we've played the game and we need more practice on our hitting, so we'll practice it. We played the game, our serving was really good, so we don't need to go and practice serving, but we do need practice at moving side to side. We played our game of basketball, everybody could dribble, everybody could catch, but we couldn't score. So now we need to go and practice shooting. And typically what happens in these tactical games is that they use 2 modifications to the rules. One of them is called representation and the other one's called exaggeration. They're complex words, but they're really easy to understand. Representation means we pick the game form, so we're still playing basketball. But what we do is we change it. Instead of playing a full court with 5 players, we might play it on a half court with 3 versus 3. Handball, we'll reduce the size of the goals, we'll reduce the size of the number of players, we'll change the ball. So we're representing handball, but we're shrinking it to suit the skill and abilities of our young people. We exaggerate the game by changing one of the rules, one of the secondary rules, to overstate a particular tactical problem. So for example, in handball, we might take out all dribbling, so you can only pass, and you must shoot after 4 passes. Or in basketball, you might play 3 versus 3. One player can dribble, only that player can dribble, but he cannot shoot. Only the other 2 can shoot. So what's that person going to do? They can't do a layup because they're not allowed to shoot. So they've got to dribble, attack the goal, get a defender to come to them, and then pass it out. And what happens typically during this tactical games is the teacher's asking a lot of questions, hoping to stimulate critical thinking. So for example, in our basketball one we just gave you, someone's dribbling towards the goal and someone comes in to defend him. The teacher goes, well, hang on. He's not allowed to shoot. Why would you defend him close to the basket? So what's the objective of that dribble? Why did you dribble towards the goal? Well, I don't know. Well, let's try it again. Maybe if you dribbled somewhere else and someone could cut from you, or if you dribbled around a screen, for example. And so these tactical games are all decided around, you play, you identify some issues that you need to practice on and discuss, and then you come back and play again. What do we know about the tactical games research? Similar to studies of teaching games for understanding, research on tactical games has tended to follow what teacher and student motivational responses have been. Or, similar to teaching games for understanding, to look at this comparison designs about what students learn when they do it via this format or those that are more motor skill based. Once again, in the case of teachers, there's a belief that students can improve in gameplay and understanding. And once again, students report enjoying trying to master the tactical dimensions of games. Once again, the comparative studies show no superior outcomes of the tactical game approach versus those that are focused more on teacher-directed instruction. A new direction, however, in tactical games research has been this examination of whether tactical understanding developed in one game might successfully transfer to another. So the ones that we've seen with net war games and those invasion games, the students played badminton first using this tactical games approach, and then their next unit was pickleball, which is, for those of you that know, it's a little bit like match puck with the net. So you're playing on a small court, like a badminton court, you hit a plastic ball back and forward over a net, very similar to sort of badminton with the bounds. And they found that there was some sort of transfer between those two games. Likewise, another group that did frisbee first and then went and played handball, those students were including some of the tactical dimensions, like cutting for a pass, defending a player off the ball, for example. So skill-wise, not much difference, but tactically, students were able to take things that they learned in this format into another game. Then we get what's called game sense, which is even more recent and is even more what I call watered down or a even less structured format of these games. So it's less prescriptive and more open to different interpretations. Game sense is described in this way. Game intelligence is the focus of game teaching. There's what we call immutable factors. What has to appear for something to be called game sense? First of all, it's small-sided, competitive games or game-like activities. So you're playing for a score. You're playing to defeat an opponent. That's the essential principle of it. In small-sided, and then within these games, the coach or the teacher is consistently asking questions. So after a rally in pickleball or badminton, why did you hit it there? I don't know. Okay, that's fine. Let's try again. And then they win again. Why did you hit it there this time? Well, because he was way back there. All right, so what was a little rule you made up in your head there? And they're back, we hit it short. All right, play again, play again, play again. All right, why did you hit the ball way up in the air that time? Right, I'm sort of going back here. Why did you do that this time? Well, I don't know. Okay, let's play again. Play, 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 and they do it again. Well, why did you do it that time? Well, it was all I could do. Right? So what's a rule that you could make up in your head for your playing? When in trouble, put the ball way up in the air. And so game sense uses this teacher-student interaction all of the time. But all of the learning is located within the game. And so within the game we develop the skill because we're playing a lot and we're playing typically against someone of similar ability. There's no point playing badminton with one low-skilled player and one high-skilled player. Low-skilled player serves, high-skilled player goes smash, rally over. High-skilled player serves, big high shot, can't return. And so within game sense, the research is again same as all of the others. Motivating climate for students, But what it does require of the teacher is that they really know their sport content. We had studies where we showed positive transfer in skill decision. Play practice is another similar one. We play, we shape the game, students ask questions, but in play practice, one of the differences is that we do focus on the technical skill. And so research on play practice has shown that we can develop some skill, particularly in table tennis. There's really only been 2 studies on play practice. And in football, that's soccer football, there's been this transfer within games. I'll just spend a couple of minutes really quickly on the invasion games competence model. It's typically coming out of Spain. Skill and learning within games. The tasks are related to the demands of the game, what the students need to know. And then the learning outcomes are evaluated within games. So in other words, they're all invasion games. Hockey, football, basketball, water polo, etc. And you play a game and then you discuss it and then you get the outcomes. There's only been one study published on this, which was looking at basketball decision making, looking at motor skills and motor efficiency. All of these were developed because what happens typically in this IGCM is that you play a basic game and then you play another game based on what was done that didn't work. And then the French model, the tactical decision model, is very similar to the tactical games in that you play a game, make a discussion, and what they have here is a debate of ideas. So the team gets together. Why did we win? Why did we lose? What do we need to do next time? All right? The next time we need to make sure that one of our players is more open. So we go back and play. And in the French researchers, essentially, they haven't done any studies on the ability of this model to develop skill. They've done studies on this debate of ideas. Right? What is the beneficial outcome of having students discuss their gameplay? And so, like all of the others, the thinking part of these games tends to be what's learned more than the skill. So let's look at where we're at. Research on sport and physical education has essentially been descriptive. Right? It's been describing teachers like it, students believe that they're more enthusiastic. Right? And we know that most of these models can achieve their goals. So we're reasonably confident that if we introduce this way of teaching sport within physical education, that we can develop skillful and tactically astute players. Right? It is possible. Now I suggest we need to change the focus, and I'm going to present 2 main agendas here really quickly. We need to increase the sophisticated nature of the designs. More dependent variables, more outcome measures, and secondly, we need to study more what's going on inside. What are teachers and students doing? What are the dynamics of their interactions? What sort of questions are teachers asking? So we've got these biggie outcomes. Enjoyment, enthusiasm, competence. Yes, 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 check, 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 we know. So these new research designs, we need to go beyond doing it in one particular school or one particular class. We also need to introduce what we call retention tests. Do the students retain this information long time after they've done the sport unit? And can they transfer it to another sport unit? But what we haven't done is we haven't looked at teacher sport content knowledge. Does the teacher teaching basketball, how much about basketball do they really need to know to do it well? It seems intuitively common sense that if you have someone teaching badminton that's a badminton expert, they'll do a better job of asking questions. We don't know that. Right? We need to get better measures of student engagement. What do students actually, they tell us, oh yeah, we like it, but are they actually performing with greater levels of intensity? Are they working harder? And then we need better measures of game performance. And so when we put these into some sort of models, what we can get is we can examine these teacher variables, we can examine the student variables. Are there differences? How does their motivation affect what happens next? How does motivation affect engagement? How does motivation and engagement affect performance? And so if we have multiple sites, so we've got 5 or 6 or 8 schools with 3 or 4, 5, 6 classes within each school, and we can measure all these things, we get a better global idea of what's going on. To do this, we think that researchers might consider more lengthy case studies, right? What's happening, what's going on, and action research projects. What happens when we try this particular way of teaching? Because our main goal is to improve the way that the model's taught. Right? How do we engage students the best? And so we need to have this closer examination of what we call the implementation of the sport models. We can say for now that they seem to work, but what are the mechanisms that drive them, that cause them to work? And so in doing that, we can change some of our methodologies. Right? We can use teacher diaries, following decision-making that takes place. We can use visual methods, having the students take pictures of their engagement. Right? What did you do on this day? Take a photo, then we'll interview you. Do drawings. And some of those things that we can include to get better outcomes from young people. We need to make sure that what the teachers were doing was in tune with what the model's expectation was. So if they say they're doing sport education, we need to demonstrate that they had those factors that make it sport education. If they're doing play practice, we need to know that they're actually doing play practice. So finally, just to wrap this up, sport is too important within culture across the world for it to disappear from physical education. And there is this real current push, sometimes in some Western European countries, of a real focus on physical activity being the main agenda. However, with the emphasis on physical activity that I'm talking about, many programs tend to disavow any connection with sport because they're focusing on all those negative outcomes that we talked about at the beginning that potentially there are. But it's not sport itself that's causing these problems, it's the way that it's taught, where teachers allow the higher skilled students to dominate. And teachers don't intervene with young people when they're engaging inappropriately with each other. That's not a sports issue, that's an instructional issue. So we need further empirical work, data-based work, to justify how a positive sport experience can provide for the majority of students. And we think with these second-generation models, they go a long way to answering that question. But finally, if nothing else, the research that we do on particular models within physical education, be it academic focus, content focus, skill focus, needs to demonstrate that students are learning. Right? So we need to go beyond the perceptions data which we've got to really demonstrate that students are learning content and developing skillful, particularly gameplay in this context during physical education. Thank you.